Today's murder story may prove unsettling to some. The victim, analog synthesis. The perpetrator, the Yamaha DX7. Hi, I'm Zach Marr from Alamo Music here in San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications. This is our Alamo Sound Lab channel where we talk about all things music technology related. And today we have a tragic tale, the death of analog synthesis at the hands of the Yamaha DX7. And more specifically, less poetically, what we are talking about, the tale we are talking about, is the transformation, the evolution of synthesis in the mid-'80s, going from strictly analog synthesis to digital synthesis, and talking about how the DX7 played the pivotal role. It was the catalyst for that transformation, and what the fallout was for the industry at the time because of the massive success of the Yamaha DX7. So let's talk about the Yamaha DX7. The Yamaha DX7 was released in the early 80s, and it was a product of years of research and development by Yamaha looking at the feasibility of an inexpensive digital synthesizer. And it was based on the research of a Stanford graduate student who's, I forgot his first name, but his last name was Channing, and he had developed a different type of synthesis called FM synthesis, and that was a form of synthesis that belongs in the category of additive synthesis. And up until that moment, the primary type of synthesis that was used in classic synthesizers like the Juno 60, the Jupiter 8, the Prophet 5, the primary type of synthesis used in the synthesizers was subtractive synthesis. And so FM synthesis, as opposed to subtractive synthesis, was a new way of synthesizing sounds. And in short, an easy way to understand the difference between subtractive synthesis and FM synthesis is the basic building block of synthesizers is their oscillators. And so a subtractive synthesizer, you take an oscillator and you have a complex waveform, and the complex waveform gets sent through the signal path, and you take things out with filters and with envelopes, and you subtract down to you sculpt the sound into a specific kind of tone that you want. On the opposite hand, FM synthesis takes a simple waveform and you add other oscillators and combine them. So you modify the simple waveform with another waveform, and it's the collision of simple waveforms to create more complex waveforms. So it's sometimes referred to as additive synthesis. So you, instead of taking a complex sound and reducing it down to simplicity, you take a simple sound and you collide it with other simple sounds to create a more complex tone. There's much more technical explanations of it, but that's the basics. And so what was neat about FM synthesis is it allowed the synthesis of much more complex acoustic-like instruments that had kind of eluded subtractive synthesis. And it was, the piano sounds, the marimba sounds that the DX7 had inside of it were the most realistic versions of these sounds that were ever to appear in a synthesizer, and it kind of blew people away. If you hear it now, you'll be like, that doesn't sound that realistic. But at the time, it was the closest thing to, an acoustic piano sound or a marimba sound, and it was just kind of mind-blowing at the time. And the DX7 became a massive, massive hit. It was the first commercially successful synthesizer. Something like 200,000 units were sold during its lifespan, which, to put into perspective, the Mini Moog, which was considered a massive success in its time, I think only like 12,000 of those were ever sold total. So the DX7 was a must-have for anybody that played keys in the 80s. And it really defines the music of the 80s. A lot of the most popular songs in the 80s, you'll find DX7 sounds all over it. So it was really disruptive to the industry. What it put, in my opinion, it put Oberheim, it put Moog, it put Sequential, put all of these primarily analog synthesized manufacturers out of business. If you look at the 80s, that's when all of the American analog synth manufacturers went out of business, and Roland struggled. Roland, who had been a powerhouse, struggled to dethrone the DX7 until the mid 80s when they finally released the D50, which was their first kind of digital workstation. And so it even dethroned Roland from kind of its trajectory, and they had to kind of pivot and figure it out. But it was massively disruptive. And when you think about it, it's interesting because there's been kind of there's a resurgence and a renaissance of analog synthesis going on currently. And what's interesting is almost like the opposite thing is happening currently. So if you put yourself back in that moment, the reason this was so magical is because it was new. It was tonally completely new for a musician. People had been exposed to analog synthesizers since the 60s, and so people were very familiar with what it was incremental gains in the kind of complexity and tonal kind of evolutions inside those instruments. And honestly, people's ears were probably tired of it after 20 years of kind of analog synthesizers being the only thing that you heard. The DX7 must have been mind-blowing. It must have been completely refreshing and just awaken musicians to, wow, these are new things that I can do with this instrument. And it really, it just kind of changed the history. It changed the trajectory of synthesis. And it's kind of similar to what's happening today. Because analog synthesizers went away, there was only really vintage pieces or boutique makers. For the most part, modern musicians up until the 2010s didn't have a way to expose their ears to analog synthesizers unless they had somehow come across a vintage piece. And I think with the mass production of inexpensive analog synthesizers, people are being exposed to all the richness and complexity of an analog synth, and they're falling in love with it, and they're like, wow, get digital away from me because I want this refreshing analog sound. And it's really the same thing that's happening, just inverted. It's just a reversal. So it's really interesting from that kind of historical standpoint to look at this and ask, like, why would a digital synthesizer be so massively successful compared to analog synthesizers? It's just supply and demand maybe, or just the uniqueness of it at the time. So what's also interesting is that FM synthesis is a just completely different way of synthesizing sounds, and it's still relevant and still used in instruments today. It's much better in a digital synth than it is in an analog synth, although you can do an analog synth that has FM synthesis. The crossover function in some of Roland's pieces, like the Jupiter 8, the JX8P, and the JX3P, and even the boutique SEO2, they have like a cross modulation. That's effectively FM synthesis, but it's a lot harder to control in an analog synthesizer. In a digital synthesizer, it works much better. And Yamaha has really continued to develop and champion FM synthesis in their Reface and in their MODX and the Montage. You can still use FM synthesis, and FM synthesis is very powerful and very strange and it's a whole different palette musically. It's sometimes described as more metallic and kind of and cold, but that can be very cool in music. Really busy electronica sometimes has FM synthesis in it. It's very aggressive. It can be very dark and grimy. It can also be very beautiful and clean. It's a very powerful synthesis kind of language, and the way it's interesting. There's a whole set of terminology that's completely different with FM synthesis versus subtractive. And there's words like algorithms, operators instead of oscillators, and what other kind of terms are there that the main difference is it's operators instead of oscillators, and then there's the way you modulate sound is pretty different. It's through algorithms, which are way more precise than subtractive synthesis. Subtractive synthesis is a lot more intuitive and easy to get pleasant sounds out. FM synthesis is really easy to screw up, and you can get really ugly sounds very easily. You can also get incredibly beautiful sounds. It just takes more, it's a little less, it takes more work to get used to it, and it's much more like a programming language than subtractive synthesis, which you can kind of sculpt and paint with a little bit more intuitively. So that's a little bit of the history of FM synthesis and the DX7. And what I'd like to do next is we're just going to play some of the sounds on the DX7. You can get a sense of what it sounds like. And then we're going to play the Reface, which is also an FM synth. It's a 4-operator FM synth or 4-oscillator FM synth, where the original was 6, and then the MODX as well, which I think is an 8-operator board. But which give you a sense of FM synthesis and the DX sound that is kind of classic, so you can get a better sense of what that is. And then ultimately we'll wrap up and kind of give some takeaways, but let's listen to it, see what you think. It was a little bit misleading when I said this was a tragic tale at the beginning. It's actually an amazing tale because this instrument was responsible for so much change and so many new sounds and new directions in music. It really was a beautiful thing. And really, I hope you get a sense of FM synthesis from this kind of demo and kind of what the instrument is and isn't. It's a beautiful piece of history. It's also just a beautiful instrument. Um, and I should also say this is not the original DX7. This was the DX7 2FD, because I know someone's going to mention it. So the DX7 2FD was just an iteration of the DX7. It came out in the later 80s, and the differences with it were they changed the there was membrane buttons originally on the original one, which people didn't like. So these are like pressing buttons that are a little more sturdy. And then it was also multi-timbral, and it had I think it had it had a floppy drive. So it had some, and it was 16-bit instead of 12-bit. So it had, this is a little upgraded. It's a little bit, considered a nicer DX7. But if you really want to own a vintage DX7, they're fairly inexpensive. You can find them for a couple $100 because there were so many sold. There are plenty available. But really, I would highly recommend checking out the Reface as a kind of modern. It's way more intuitive to use than a classic DX7. Or if you really want to go hard into FM synthesis and kind of take it to the next level, the MODX is really the latest kind of iteration of FM synthesis from Yamaha and represents the fullest evolution of the DX7 and kind of its history. The MODX, and I should say it's Montage, which is the flagship one. But that's just my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did I leave anything out? What other cool things about the DX7 are there to know? I love to hear comments below. Again, if you haven't subscribed, please hit the subscribe button. And if you want to talk to us, go to alamomusic.com. You can chat with us, send us an email, give us a call. We'd love to chat more about synths with you or whatever else about music technology. And again, appreciate you watching. Thank you for watching, and we'll talk to you next time.